clock says noon. So I am going to go ahead and get started with some announcements and some housekeeping notes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our virtual Laguna Community Education Program, A User's Guide to the Watershed. Feel free to say hello in the chat box and let us know where you are tuning in from today if you haven't already. My name is Allison Titus. I am the Community Education Manager here at the Laguna Foundation. In addition to Wendy, we are also joined by Christine Fontaine, our wonderful Education Director here at the Laguna Foundation. She'll be managing the chat, fielding questions during the webinar, and adding helpful links to resources while we go through the webinar. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Allison. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your support of our programs.
I'll keep my introduction even more brief than usual since we will be learning all about the Laguna from Wendy. All you need to know to start out is that the Laguna Foundation is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa that works to restore, conserve, and inspire public appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa wetlands. The Laguna is a wetland complex and a 22-mile-long channel, as well as an entire watershed, which we'll talk a lot about today. I'll give you a hint. If you live in Cotati, Rohnert Park, Santa Rosa, or Windsor, you live within and use the Laguna watershed. Even though many of you are probably practice Zoomers at this point in our shelter-in-place experience, I'll still start with a few housekeeping notes for a successful webinar experience. So you are muted and your video is off, and that is on purpose. Christine and I will have our video on during the introduction and the closing and when we are fielding questions through the webinar. Wendy will leave her video on through the webinar. You do not have the ability to turn your video on, and if you did, it would be pretty chaotic. So please interact with us through the chat box. We would love to hear your questions and to see who's out there. So as I said, you can hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom screen, and the option to select the chat box should pop up. If you click on the chat box icon and you can say hi if you haven't already. Also, another note, please use that drop-down menu. It's super small. There's a gray drop-down menu above your chat box to address questions to either all panelists or all panelists and attendees. If you want everyone who's attending the webinar to see your question or your comment, you can select all panelists and attendees. If you have a question that you really just want to direct to Christine, who will bring it up to Wendy, you can just select all panelists. I know that's a next level housekeeping note, but we have found it to be very helpful in our online programs. The last housekeeping note I have is that we will pause during the webinar to take questions that are coming up in the chat and also to do some interactive polls. It should be lots of fun. If you see a poll pop up on your screen, we want you to answer it, and Wendy will talk about what you should, she'll indicate when that's happening and give you directions about that. If you have a question that we didn't get to during the webinar, we will follow up with an email after the webinar has concluded, answering any questions we didn't get to. So feel free to put them out there, and you might get an answer later on from us in an email. All right, I think that's it for my housekeeping notes. I am happy to have Wendy here to give this program. Wendy became the director of our restoration and conservation programs in January 2015. She is a wetland plant ecologist who has worked in a variety of systems from the Sacramento River to Ruby Lakes in northern Nevada to rangelands in western China. She received her PhD from UC Davis as a part of a multidisciplinary study of riparian restoration on the Nature Conservancy's Cosumnes River Preserve. So prior to joining the foundation, she was a research faculty member at the University of Nevada, Reno, where her research focused on invasive species, wetland communities, and aquatic food webs. In addition to her academic experience, she has also taught environmental education, managed a native plant nursery, and volunteered counting hawks for the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. I also wanted to say Wendy is yet another person who was very quick to agree to turning her in-person presentation that was on our calendar for months into an online program during this time. And it's in the midst of her busiest season, no less. So Wendy, thank you for coming out of the weeds, literally, to join us to talk about the Laguna watershed and share your insights about the unique challenges it faces as well as hope for the future. Stay tuned at the end of the program for more learning opportunities coming up in just a couple days. So that concludes my announcements for the time being. Wendy, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Oh, thanks, Allison. And thanks for that great introduction and all the housekeeping notes about webinars. Allison may be very experienced with this, but this is my first webinar. So thank you guys in advance for being patient. I'm here in Heron Hall and it is lonely here without you guys. I miss seeing you drinking tea and eating cookies and talking to me. So definitely interact with me in the chat, and Chris will pop up and ask me questions, and it'll make me feel like I'm not so alone out here. And maybe so that you will feel like you're not so alone there at home in your by your computer. Anyway. So today's topic is a user's guide to the watershed. And eventually, oh, there we go. Okay, so because this is a webinar and slightly different from a regular presentation, I decided to split it into 3 shorter chapters just to try and keep it interesting and keep people engaged. So the first chapter is going to be just an introduction to the watershed and what makes it so cool and unique. The second chapter will be about climate change, and the third chapter will be a really exciting news story that we have about a vernal pool restoration project that we're working on. So I'll just launch right into the watershed introduction. And so I just want to quickly make sure that we're all on the same page about what a watershed is. So the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed is part of the larger Russian River watershed. And you can see the Russian River watershed goes all the way up to Willits, and the Russian River flows down here and then enters the ocean here by Jenner. And the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed is this circle down here. And it is the largest tributary of the Russian River. And so the cool thing about watersheds is that they are nested within each other. So here is the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed, but inside that there's the Santa Rosa Creek watershed, the Marquess Creek watershed, and inside of that, there's a whole nother set of watersheds. There's inside the upper watershed there's Copeland Creek and Crane Creek, and this is a picture of us collecting seeds up by Hood Mountain. So a watershed is an area that collects sediment and rain and moves it out to a single location. So the Laguna watershed collects rainwater and sediment up here in the Mayacamas Mountains and moves it through all these tributaries down to Forestville, where it meets the Russian River. And okay, so this is our first poll, and Allison is going to launch the poll here in a second. And the question is going to be, oh, here it is. And actually the poll popped up over the animal. And so if you click and drag, you can move the poll to the left, but there's just 2 quick questions. Do you live in the watershed? And can you identify this particular wet animal who's crawling out of the Laguna? And so we'll give you just a few minutes to fill that out. And then I will talk about the results. And so we have wildlife cameras set up at various places throughout the Laguna watershed, primarily our restoration sites. And this particular wildlife camera is on Brown Farm, and we have a restoration site on Gravenstein Creek in Brown Farm, where this particular animal likes to hang out. I told Allison to leave it up for a minute, but it turns out a minute is a lot of dead air when you're giving a presentation. Oh, there we go. So it looks like 70% of you guys live in the watershed and 30% don't. And most of you thought that that was a river otter. It turns out that actually that was a mink, which is really cool. Otters have slightly longer tails, among other differences. Cool. So thank you guys for that. And let's move on to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So this is just a cartoon of your basic garden variety watershed, the kind of that you learn about in school. The important thing about this is that you can see it is V-shaped down at the bottom. You know, the mountains come up on either side and the river is down at the bottom of the V. One of the coolest things, this is the Laguna watershed. You can see the Mayacamas Mountains over here on the right and the mountains by Sebastopol over on the left. The cool thing about the Laguna watershed, it has these two faults, the Sebastopol fault and the Rogers Creek fault coming through the middle of them. And you can see that it is not V-shaped in the way that all those other watersheds are. It is sort of, I don't know what you'd call that, U-shaped, flattened U-shaped. And this is the source of all the really cool things and a lot of the problems with our particular watershed. It is the reason that we have awesome vernal pools and terrific wetlands. It's the reason that the Russian River flows up into the Laguna, and the Laguna actually flows two directions because it's so flat. The Russian River floodwater backs up into the Laguna. It's flat the side to side, but it's also flat towards the Russian River. And so when the Russian River comes up, it floods into the Laguna. But the fact that it's flat in the middle also is the reason that we have some problems with water quality, because the water quality never actually flushes out to the Russian River in the way it does in many river systems. So this flatness in the middle is a really important component. And so also the precipitation in our watershed, the watershed is this orange line around the edge, is not evenly distributed. So everyone talks about like, oh, it rained an inch today or an inch and a half or whatever the weather person says. But in fact, it often rains twice as much on the top of Sonoma Mountain as it does in the town of Santa Rosa. And so the other function of the watershed is to move all the rain that happens in the upper portion down into the Santa Rosa Plain. And oh, that's the floodplain. Okay. And as you know, not only is precipitation variable across the watershed, but it's variable through time. This is just a graph of all the different rainfalls from 1895 through the present. And you can see that sometimes it rains almost 60 inches and sometimes it rains, just over 10. And this is from the airport. So, oh, Chris, I see someone has a question.
Yes, there is a question from the chat, Wendy. Now seems like a good time for it too. The question is, did the lake that used to be off Occidental Road, so Lake Honeve, help to mitigate flooding?
Yeah, no. It didn't. Yes, so there used to be this really cool lake called Lake Honive, but by the time when flooding happens, the lake is already full. So the lake was full before it started to rain, and then it fills up after it starts to rain, it fills up the whole floodplain, so that because the lake is full, it doesn't play any role in flood control. Does that make sense, Chris?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about sediment transport. And sediment transport is just the mechanism by which mountains are eroded out towards the ocean. So basically the water breaks down the rocks into little tiny rocks, and then the rivers move the tiny rocks out towards the ocean. And depending on how big the tiny rocks are, they're either sand or maybe silt or gravel, but the faster running water can move heavier rocks because it's just stronger, it can do more work. And so the way that the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed used to work is the big creek started up here in the mountains, in the Mayacamas Mountains, and flowed down really quickly. So this is steep. And sorry, it's very steep, and the water flows really fast and carries a lot of sediment. And then when it hits the flat of the Santa Rosa Plain, it drops a lot of that sediment. And that's why there are these amazing vernal pools and wetlands out in the middle of the Santa Rosa Plain, because all of this sediment got dropped here at the edge of the mountains, and then the fine grained sediments came out into the middle of this plain. So this is a picture of what used to happen historically. And whoops, and here's a picture of what happens now. So in the modern era, we have built cities and on these alluvial fans at the base of the Mayacamas Mountains. And in order to keep our cities from flooding, we have built flood control channels that go straight out to the Laguna. And these are straight, narrow, deep channels that just, they're like a fire hose. They take all the water and the sediment and deliver it directly to the Laguna. And that's what this brown shape is trying to show, that it's trying to show historically there was not very much sediment deposition in the Laguna because it was all deposited out onto the plain and in the alluvial fans. And now in the modern era, there's much more sediment deposition in the Laguna because these flood control channels direct all the sediment out there. And then also nutrient dynamics have changed a lot since the historic time. So historically, most of the nutrients that were loaded into the Laguna, so loading just means added into the Laguna. So most of the nutrient loading happened in the Mayacamas through erosion off the hill slopes and that sort of thing. But now, if you look below at the modern, most of the nutrient inputs are coming from the Santa Rosa Plain. And that's just because that's where we do our agriculture. We have dairy cows, we have vineyards, we have all kinds of row crops and agriculture growing on the Santa Rosa Plain, and these contribute nutrients into the Laguna. And so the point of the last two slides is we're adding more nutrients and more sediment directly to the Laguna. Whoops, wrong direction, sorry. And then back historically, the nutrients and sediment that did come into the Laguna were historically trapped in wetlands. And so on the left, you have a map of the historic plant communities. And I know that's a bazillion plant communities and it's hard to read flashing by on a screen. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that there were a lot of valley freshwater marsh, this big section here. And there was a lot of wet meadow, which is this color here. And the next slide shows basically just how much of each of these different types there were historically and how much there is now. And so again, the two main communities that I'm talking about here are this wet meadow community and the valley freshwater marsh community. And you can see there used to be a lot of both, and now there is very little of either. here, and you can see the numbers down below. Whoops, strangely, I moved the slide forward. Anyway, so you can see that it's the Valley Freshwater Marsh is down 81%, and the wet meadow is down 74%. And so not only are we putting more nutrients and sediment into the laguna, but we have 70 to 80% less wetlands to process those nutrients. And so how do wetlands process nutrients? Well, these are very complicated slides. Again, this is just the nitrogen cycle over on the left and the phosphorus cycle over on the right. And basically the idea is that nutrients cycle through the water column. But the key difference here is that if you notice this N2 floating up here in the air, the nitrogen cycle is critically different from the phosphorus cycle because there is a gaseous form of nitrogen. So nitrogen can come into balance with the air, and so bacteria there's denitrification that happens in wetlands and takes the nitrogen out of the water column and puts it into the air. Whereas the phosphorus cycle, as you see, just keeps going around and around and around. And so all the excess, excuse me, all the excess phosphorus that we've put into the laguna is just still cycling around. And so here's another way that nutrients leave the laguna. The nutrients can, oh, excuse me, sorry, allergies. The nutrients can be essentially turned into invertebrates and turned into animals. And then the invertebrates are eaten by aerial insectivores, which are in turn often eaten by other animals. And the kestrel can come in and eat the cliff swallow that's eating the mosquitoes. The osprey is coming in and eating fish. And all of these things are removing nutrients from the laguna through the food web. And then one other complicating factor with nutrient cycling in the laguna is dissolved oxygen. And Ludwigia, which is an invasive species in the laguna, plays a critical role with dissolved oxygen. You can see in the picture, there's all this green biomass during the summertime. And then as it dies in the fall, it doesn't die completely, but it dies back, I should say. When it dies back in the fall, it uses up all the oxygen in the water as it rots, and it creates anoxic conditions, which can kill the fish, but also which makes phosphorus more soluble and brings more phosphorus back into the water column and increases our nutrient problems. Okay, so that is the end of the intro to the watershed. Chris, does anyone have any additional questions about the intro to the watershed section?
There was just a question about what is Delta Pond?
Yes, well, that is an excellent question. Delta Pond is part of the Laguna treatment plants, the system that it has for treating wastewater. And so treated wastewater is stored in ponds throughout the Santa Rosa Plain and then used to irrigate fields. And so it's basically part of a storage system. But the unique, interesting thing about Delta Pond is it's one of the places where treated wastewater is discharged into the laguna. If in a situation where there's too much wastewater in the wastewater plant, they do release some into the laguna. It doesn't happen every year. And most treatment plants, that's their MO. They release into the water, into the local rivers all the time, but ours mostly sends water up to the geysers and uses it for irrigation. Yeah, this is a whole big diversion that I'm going on. Suffice it to say, Delta Pond is a storage facility for treated wastewater. And if you want to know more, email me, because clearly I could go on about this quite a bit.
One other quick question. Are there strategies to mitigate the phosphorus problem?
Yes. So the North Coast Water Quality Control Board is the regulatory agency responsible for controlling water quality in the Laguna and all the waters of California, or of the North Coast, I guess. And so they have a plan through water quality credits rating and a number of other alternative plans to reduce phosphorus in the Laguna. It's still in the plan, haven't fully implemented it, but we are working towards limiting nutrients in the Laguna.
And one more great question. If sediment load is increasing in the Laguna Channel, will flooding become worse?
Yes. Yes, it will. Good question. Not like today, but as the more sediment fills in, clearly our flood capacity is decreased. We are working at the same time to remove sediment, and so we hope to at some point get to a balance of removing more sediment than we're putting in, but we are nowhere near that yet. So again, we're working on it, but there's still a ways to go.
All right. This is one of those.
So I want to just, yeah, I want to keep moving though and make sure we've got enough time.
Okay.
Happy ending.
All right, great. See you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Yes.
So the next section is about climate change. And I think since most of you guys live in Sonoma County, you probably recognize both of these phenomena from 2019. This is the floods in February of 2019, and this is the Kincaid fire, also of 2019, but of October. And so this is our next poll, and Allison's going to launch the poll, but the poll is about how you feel about hot days and temperature. I'm about to show you a graph of the temperature from the number of days with above 95 degree temperatures from 1902 to the present. So this question is, what do you think the trend is? Do you think there are more days over 95 degrees recently, or less, fewer days? And also, if you drag the poll to the left there, you can still see the poor little guy crawling out of the water there. And you can answer that poll too. So this number of days over 95 degrees is one of the ways in which scientists measure climate change. And it's a thing that I feel like that people can really wrap their heads around. I feel like every time it's a hot day and you run into someone at the supermarket, they're like, oh my God, it never used to be hot like this. And so I think it helps us sort of calibrate our feelings about how hot it is and how hot we're getting. So Chris, what do you think about days over 95 degrees? Do you think they're increasing or decreasing?
Let me start my video here, Wendy.
Well, all right. Sorry,
so
did I catch you off guard?
No, that's okay. I moved to Sonoma County in '88, and I've lived in so many places in the county. I don't know if I can answer it broadly, but my experience is that it does seem like there's more hot days since I moved here in the late '80s.
Yeah, well, look, there are the poll results. It looks like you're in good company. 63% of people have noticed more hot days. 31% say it's about the same, and 6% says they haven't noticed any change. And 76% of people know a Western pond turtle. That's awesome. That warms my heart. Okay, so let's look at the data. Okay, so as you can see, first, let me describe this data. So this is just a scattering of points, but each one of these points represents the number of days where the temperature was over 95 degrees. So, you know, back in 1937 here, you can see it was a scorcher. There were 21 days over 95 degrees. And I just split the data in half to do the average and standard deviation so you could see if there's any shift through time. And when you look at the data, there actually has not been a huge increase between 1902 and the present day in the number of days over 95. It's gone up a little, but it hasn't gone up a lot. But Chris's answer is particularly interesting because if you look at the data from the 80s onward, so if Chris had moved here in the mid 80s when there were 0 days over 95 degrees, and then now, you know, in 2017 there was something like 17 days over 95. So from her perspective, it seems like, whoa, it is a whole lot hotter. And I think that is one of the reasons that people have a hard time wrapping their mind around climate change, is that we all have different lengths of perspective. And that's what this picture is about down here. There's, you know, some of the younger people in this picture have, you know, weren't even born back in the 70s when it was really hot. And so their perspective is all from here. And then there's me and Brent over here who have, you know, we definitely remember the 70s, let's just say. So anyway, the point is that we all have a different perspective on climate change. And here's some modeling about what might happen in the future with the number of days over 95 degrees. And so here we are down here in 2020, and the climate change models project that through time, the number of days over 95, and the different colored lines are just different climate models. We don't really know what's going to happen, but we have a couple different models, different ideas about what's going to happen. And the dotted lines represent other areas. So basically what I'm trying to say is through time, this hotter model says we're going to, by 2080, Santa Rosa is going to look more like Cloverdale than it does now, and possibly even like Ukiah or Sacramento. And so that, as if you can think about those places, that represents a fair amount of change in the heat of our summers and possibly our plant communities. Okay, so this is the next poll. And this is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. This is talking about how many cold days that we have below freezing. And so, oh, here's the poll. And so if you move it, if you drag and drop the poll to the left, you can still see that lovely bird flying along. And so this is how many days per year the temperature drops below freezing. So do you think, and this is about like, you know, how many times do you have to run out and cover up those citrus to keep them from freezing? Or, you know, how many times do the vineyards have to use frost control protection and, you know, use either sprinklers or those fans? So the temperature, freezing temperatures are a really important cutoff. All right, I'll give you a minute. So how many of you, I wonder how many of you can identify that bird? We have a lot of birders in the group. I feel like most birders will know. Maybe I gave too many easy options on that one. Yep, everybody knows that that's a kingfisher. And most people also have noticed fewer freezing nights, and some people think it stayed the same, and some people have noticed more freezing nights. So let's take a look at that data. And so you can see that unlike the number of days over 95, the number of days below freezing has changed significantly over the last 100 years. And so for the first part of this data set through 1965, there were an average of 37, 38 days below freezing every winter, nights below freezing, I should say. And then now there's more like 10 or 15 days below, with nights below freezing. And so this is a huge change and very important to the agricultural crops in Sonoma County, particularly Gravenstein apples, but all apples really have a certain number of chill hours that they require to produce fruit. And Gravensteins in particular require 700 hours of temperatures below 45 degrees in order to produce fruit. And as we get fewer and fewer cold nights, growing apples will be less and less viable in Sonoma County. But the same, it's not just apples, the same is true of, peaches and nectarines and cherries and all kinds of fruit. They all have this, not all of them, but many of them have this chill requirement. And it also has a big implication for the distribution of native species as well. One of the cool things about Sonoma County is that it's right at the edge of two different plant communities. North of us is all the Pacific Northwest, and so, Doug firs and, redwoods in California, but it's sort of this moist, dark forest type landscape. And then south of us is more like LA, coastal live oaks, that kind of plant community. And the cool thing about Sonoma County is that we have both. We're right at this border. And so it's a very diverse area, plant community wise. But as the climate changes and temperatures become warmer, often the distribution of plants is governed more by freezing temperatures and how much freezing temperatures rather than actual heat in the summer. And so you'll see certain species like Doug fir and Oregon ash here. Sonoma County, right where my cursor is now in both of these, is right at the southern end of the distribution of Doug fir and Oregon ash. And so as it gets warmer here, those two types of trees are going to struggle more and more, and we're going to become less like the Pacific Northwest, whereas coastal live oaks are going to become happier and happier because they're actually at the northern end of their distribution. And as the temperatures in Sonoma County become more like LA, it's going to be right up the coastal live oaks alley. They're going to be really stoked. And then you can see all the way on the right there's elderberry, which is one of my favorite plants. And elderberry can grow all the way from Mexico up to British Columbia. So clearly climate change is going to have less impact on some species and more impact on others, just depending on their current ranges and their susceptibility to temperature change. And finally, this is a graph of precipitation. The way my zoom is, the box with my talking head is over the interesting data, which is the red dot here. So you can move your zoom box, you can move me in my little box around if I'm in the way. But in any case, the red dot here is the important part. So this is precipitation through time, again, 1895 through the present, and the red dot is the present. That's this year's rainfall so far. I mean, it looks like it might be trying to rain again today, so maybe we'll get a little bit more, but this is so far. And you can see that through time, in the first half of the data, the average precipitation was a little bit lower than it has been recently. But also the key piece of this particular graph is the standard deviation, these dotted lines, and they've become wider through time. And so the wet years are getting wetter and the dry years are getting drier. And so the spread of the data is greater. But this particular year, it has been very dry. As you may have noticed, it didn't really rain in February. And February is one of our wetter years. But Is this the driest year in the history of the world? No. It has been drier. It was drier in the 70s. It was drier in the, I think this is the 20s. And so, you know, we have wet times and we have dry times. So one of the questions is, well, how is that going to impact us? And so this is kind of a wonky graph of our water storage. And so we in Sonoma County and parts of Marin, the water agency stores water for us to drink in Lake Sonoma and Lake Mendocino up by Ukiah. And you can see the black line is the current levels of the reservoir. And so the months are down at the bottom and the acre feet of water in the reservoir are on the left. So the higher the line, the more water in the reservoir. And you can see that often in many years, the water peaks during the rainy season and there's a lot of water. But this year, the reservoirs barely went up. And so we're back down to where we were in 2015 and Lake Sonoma. And Lake Sonoma, you'll also notice that these numbers over here are a lot bigger than these numbers over here. Lake Sonoma can hold twice as much water as Lake Mendocino. And so both of them are low, but not critically low. So we're in good shape as far as drinking water for one more year. So long as it rains next year, we should be fine. But if you were thinking about installing a laundry to landscape system to reuse your gray water, or maybe installing some rainwater catchment system, this might be a good year to do something like that. Perhaps while you're, I don't know, socially distancing. And so that's one end of the spectrum is drought. And the other end of the spectrum is flooding. And so not only are we going to have more droughts, but we're going to have more flooding. And this, the graphic over on the right is just a map of the different floodplains for different years. And 2015 was the last really dry year. 2017, this is a picture of the gates to the Laguna Foundation in 2017. And we thought this was an awesome flood. And we went out and we went kayaking. We kayaked down to get the mail, and that was super fun. And it was the biggest flood anyone had seen in a while. And then 2 years later, it was even deeper. And so you can see those same gates now are completely underwater. And so this is the 2019 flood, which flooded Sebastopol in 2019. And you can see, and some of the climate models are predicting that that for an individual flood, like the 20-year flood or the 10-year flood, each one of those flood recurrence intervals could be as much as 10 feet deeper on the Russian River. And so if you imagine this is the 2019 was somewhere around the 20-year flood. And if the 20-year flood was 10 feet deeper, I could say the farmhouse might not be in great shape. Right now, the farmhouse is out of the 100-year floodplain. But if we're getting bigger floods, it could be within the 100-year, it could be within the 20-year floodplain. And much of Sebastopol is obviously in a similar situation. This is the village, the old location of the village bakery. On a nice day, showing the flood control structures here, where you could put barriers to keep the floodwaters from getting into the village bakery. And here it's the same building from a slightly different angle with the kayak and sadly with no barriers. But you can see this is Sebastopol. And for those of you who are local, Screaming Mimi's is right here on the corner. And I always say that Screaming Mimi's is like the boundary of the 100-year floodplain. So fortunately, it looks like Screaming Mimi's might be safe, but Hot Monk also looks like it's going under in the 100-year flood. The 100-year flood is just an arbitrary calculation, but it gives you some idea of what a really big flood might look like around here. Okay, so are there any questions about the climate change section of the talk?
I want to actually, yes, there is one from the climate change, and if you don't mind going back to the previous section,
Oh, yeah.
there's
Oh,
one
that's
more
fine.
question left over from that. Let me start with that one. What is the problem with too much phosphorus?
Right, yes. Nutrients, it seems like it could be a good thing, right? So the problem with too much nutrients is that plants, that it creates algae blooms and plant growth, which then die back and create low dissolved oxygen. And that kills the fish and the other things that live in the water and need to breathe the water. And so all these, the Water Quality Control Board regulates a whole bunch of different parameters, from nitrogen and phosphorus and bacteria and dissolved oxygen and mercury. And they all come back to this one question of, if you have too many nutrients in a water body, it uses up all the oxygen, and then there's nothing left for the fish that eat there and then that live there, and then there's no fish for the bald eagles to eat, and it's a whole big web.
Okay, great. And then one more about climate change. You were talking about oaks and the elderberries and the impacts that climate change will have on those species. In the chat, there was another question about redwood trees. Do you have any information about redwood trees?
Yeah, well, I don't have, I haven't read any scientific papers on it, but if you think about it, what's the distribution of a redwood tree? Well, the southern distribution of the redwoods is in Big Sur, and the northern distribution is right on the Oregon border. And so the idea is, as it gets hotter, the redwoods would shift further north. So you would have more redwoods in southern Oregon and fewer redwoods in the Big Sur, or maybe here, because we're closer to Big Sur. So redwoods are definitely one of those species that are on the edge. And they, from a paleo-ecological perspective, they have been on the edge for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So they're good at hanging on.
Great, okay. Let's see, maybe we have time for one more quick question. Is there periodic dredging of the Laguna for flood management?
No, yes and no. So there is more regular dredging of the creeks that flow into the Laguna. So there's yearly dredging of Copeland Creek, of Santa Rosa Creek. And so the goal has been to get the sediment before it gets to the Laguna. And that works really well for coarse grain sediment, for things like little rocks and gravel and pebbles. That is taken out of the creeks before it gets to the Laguna. But the problem is that the really fine stuff, the clays that make the water brown and muddy looking, those things make it all the way to the Laguna. And we have not in the past had a plan as a community, for how we're gonna get those fine sediments out. And so if you go to where Stony Point crosses the Laguna at the Southern Laguna Trail, there's the water agency just did a big project to do just that, to remove the fine grained sediment from the Laguna. And last time I was there, alas, social distancing, I haven't been there recently, but last time I was there, it was looking really good. So, and I think that is going to be that's going to be a hallmark of the water board's strategy to remove phosphorus, is to remove these phosphorus, because phosphorus is very sticky and it sticks to sediment. And so if you're removing fine-grained sediment, you're also removing phosphorus from the system. And so it's sort of a 2-for-1. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right. So now we're going to go on to the next the next and final chapter, which is a little bit about a vernal pool restoration project that I've been working on with Sarah Gordon and Asa Voigt from the Laguna Foundation. And we have been working together with the regional parks, the water agency, Sweet Gas Grazing, Santa Rosa Junior College, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife to restore some vernal pools. And these vernal pools are out by the Laguna de Santa Rosa Trail. It's the regional parks property right by the trail there. And when I first started my job in 2015, the picture below there is what that field looked like. You can see that it is overgrown by this thatch, all that dead grass lying down in the picture, that's called thatch. And the person's hand there is holding the thatch in their hand. And over here on the left is a vernal pool that is covered in cockleburr. And so when I first went out to this field, this is what it looked like. But then when I looked on our servers at the Laguna Foundation, I saw this map that showed that in 2007, there was Sebastopol meadow foam all over this field. And I kept going out there and looking at this and saying, Brent, was there really Sebastopol meadow foam out here? And every year we would go and hunt up the last 2 Sebastopol meadow foam plants. And we really felt like, you know, something should be done to restore these vernal pools. And so we worked with the regional parks and applied for funding from the water agency, and they funded us to do a restoration project. And so clearly the first step of this restoration project was going to have to be to remove this thatch. And so we hired that project out to some very diligent hard workers here. They all have their heads down, working very hard, removing thatch. They're actually eating grass, which would then become thatch. So they don't actually eat all that dead grass, but their hooves break up the dead grass so that it can float away. This area floods in the wintertime. And the idea is that the sheep are eating this year's grass, and they're breaking up the thatch so that it can be more in contact with the ground and break down more, but also so that it can be washed away more in the floods. And so they're working really hard. We've had them out there for 2 years now, and it's been night and day, the amount of thatch out there. It is really terrific. But the vernal pools were still a little thatch covered, and we were worried that they might not, that the small annual plants that are unique to these vernal pools might not be able to grow through the thatch. So we got a botany class from the junior college to come out and help us rake these vernal pools. And I imagine, well, either these kids had a really great imagination or they were somewhat depressed by what they were doing. It's hard in the fall to imagine what this is going to look like in the spring. But in any case, they worked really hard. They helped us get all this thatch out, which laid the groundwork for another project that we were working on at the same time, which was collecting this Sebastopol meadow foam seed. And so the previous spring, when the last 2 Sebastopol meadow foam plants bloomed, Sarah Gordon got a permit and went out and collected seed. So she needs a permit because this is an endangered species. And so she collected the seeds, and she had to scrounge on the ground, and she came up with 400 tiny little Sebastopol meadow foam seeds. And then Walter helped us carefully plant all of these seeds into these little trays, and they started coming up and growing, and we potted them on to bigger plants, but we weren't sure if they were going to flower or not in the nursery. And so we were a little worried, and they got bigger, but still no flowers. What was going to happen? And then the first few flowers started to come, and we started to feel like, oh, this is going to be a success. And then finally, victory, they really went crazy, and the flowers just took off, and they started making seeds. And we realized that we didn't really know how to collect seeds from this many Sebastopol meadowfoam plants. There were 400 of these plants out there, and each one of them had, 12 flowers. Each flower had, I don't know, 4 or 5 seeds. And so what we decided was once they died back, we got a shop vac and we vacuumed up all the seeds and a lot of the dirt. And then we separated the seeds from the dirt. And we were left with clean seeds, like that's Asa's hand. And the original 400, 500 seeds that Sarah collected turned into 130,000 seeds in the nursery. And Asa and Sarah went out, and you can see what a great job that the SRJC kids did raking those vernal pools. They're looking really nice. And Asa is about to spread those seeds out across the field there. And so we were really enthusiastic about this. Oh, and we didn't just spread them willy-nilly around the field. We had that map from 2007. So we went out to exactly all the places where we had mapped it in 2007, and we spread the seed in only the places where we knew it had been at one point in the past. And so then in December, it rained, and you can see these little green leaves coming up here. These are Sebastopol meadowfoam leaves. And so we went out in the winter, and we were so excited that our seeds were coming up. This was going to be great. And then, if you remember what happened, it stopped raining, and all of us individually went out there in February and early March and looked at it, and we're like, oh no, because you could see all the little meadowfoam plants in the bottom of the vernal pools, and they were alive, but they looked really sad because they were dry. And usually these plants are sort of floating on the top of the water, and they were all like sad and in the bottom of the vernal pool. And so the pools went from looking like this to looking like that. And you can sort of tell from this picture why this is called meadow foam, because it forms this white swashes of flowers through the grassland there. And so this is Asa wearing his appropriate mask and gloves and looking really excited about the Sebastopol meadow foam that's coming up. And this is what was actually the edge of the historic distribution. And so we stopped raking and planting seed right where that line in the middle of the screen is. And so you can see that our management activity really had a big impact. And the amazing thing was that not only did Sebastopol meadow foam come back, but a whole suite of other vernal pool plants just came back as well, because we had done such a great job raking. And so there's some buttercups and some lupins and some rayless asters down there. And then there's the Downingia came back. And so this was a huge, and you can see the native bumblebees and the honeybees were all out there pollinating. And this is not the best focused picture in the world, but you can see right there in the middle is that they've already started making seeds. And so there are going to be seeds for next year. And when we get the sheep to come out and clear the thatch this year, the seeds will have all fallen to the ground and they'll be ready to germinate next year. All right, whew, I made it with a minute to spare. So this is the much promised badger from all those polls. I don't know if you guys noticed. Wow, it's really sad to make a joke and then I can't hear, nobody's laughing. It's just me alone. Anyway, here's the badger. So are there any final questions?
There were some more questions, but I'm going to keep it to one. Will you make some comments about the recently published Laguna Vision?
Yeah, so this is great. The Laguna Foundation and the San Francisco Estuary Institute and the Water Agency have gotten together. We got a planning grant from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to make a plan for restoration in the Laguna de Santa Rosa. And so it's restoration for the whole 100-year floodplain. And so some of the slides I showed you were from that vision document, and we're actually just working on putting that the PDF of that document on our website, and it's great. It has a lot of historical ecology and a lot of planning for the future. And so the vision document is just the first step of this planning grant that we got. And the next step is to come up with flesh out some of our restoration project ideas. And ultimately we will be at 65% design for one project, and we'll be able to implement one project. Okay, now it's 1 o'clock. But check out the vision. It's really cool.
Yeah. As Wendy said, that'll be on our website very soon. Thanks for answering all the questions. Thanks for a great presentation,
Yeah,
Wendy.
thank you guys so much for coming out. I really appreciate you joining me here on this webinar. I know it's a little hard, but I appreciate you letting us come into your house and chat with you about the Laguna.
Yeah, thanks for wanting to know more about the watershed we all share. Ellison, back to you.
Thank you, Wendy, for giving us so much useful information about our watershed. I know I learned a lot today, and I also had fun doing it. So thanks for doing those polls and keeping us engaged. You had an attentive audience that whole time. Thank you all out there for attending and participating today, and thanks for supporting our online programs. Now is the time to add any last comments to the chat. I'll be ending the webinar after these few brief announcements. If you have the means to donate at this time to support our critical conservation, restoration, and education work in the Laguna watershed, some of which we talked about today, we would greatly appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who donated upon registering for this program. I really appreciate that as well. We have one webinar per week scheduled until mid-June. So visit our website. You can sign up for those. They're all at noon, except for the program with the regional parks. Coming up next week, we have a longtime Laguna steward, Denise Cadman, tuning in to talk about life in the Laguna. And she'll be talking about the different ecosystems in our watershed and what critters live there, which Wendy alluded to several times today. The week after that, we are continuing the wildlife theme with an animal tracking webinar with Megan Wallum-Murphy. And I'm sure you'll find her insight helpful even for tracking wildlife around suburban Santa Rosa homes, if you're like me. We'll start off June with another webinar with botanist and Santa Rosa Junior College instructor Caprice Disbrow on the co-evolution of plants and pollinators. And finally conclude our spring run of virtual programs with Laguna de Santa Rosa past and present with Sonoma County Regional Parks. So if you're interested in any of that, you can sign up on Eventbrite, and we'd love to see you again. Thanks for continuing to learn about and engage with the Laguna from home. I think that's it for my announcements. Wendy, thank you again for your wonderful presentation. Christine, thank you for your management of the chat and questions. And I hope all you out there in the audience take good care of yourselves. Thank you, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.